playing with his knife, flicking it from hand to hand. Although whether it was because he was tense or because he was really relaxed, no one knows. When he'd finished, the king didn't argue or try to negotiate. He just said yes, with the tiny caveat that the people should continue to respect the monarchy. Wat was thirsty. He called for some water. He took a drink, swirled it round in his mouth, and spat it out. Then he ordered some beer. He drank that and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. And at that moment, when they seemed to be on the verge of the greatest social revolution the world had ever known, things started to unravel. "Oi!" shouted a squire near the king. "I know you. You're the biggest thief in Kent." That narked Wat. He said, "Come here and say that." And he ordered his men to lop off the squire's head. But no one moved. Instead, the Mayor of London rode forward, either to reason with Tyler or to provoke him. The chronicles differ as to precisely what happened next, but what is clear is that some kind of scuffle broke out. Wat tried to stab the mayor, but he was wearing armour and stabbed Wat in the back of the neck instead. Then someone else whacked him. Wat tried to ride back to the safety of his men, but before he'd got 80 paces, he fell off his horse. The peasant bowmen tensed, ready to rain down arrows on the king and his men. Behind them were others with flails and billhooks. There was enough firepower to wipe out the entire bodyguard. Even the king himself was in danger. But on the brink of disaster, Richard himself dealt the fatal blow to the peasants' revolt. He was only 14, but he was brave. He rode straight towards the sea of rebel bowmen. "You shall have no other king but me," he shouted. "Follow me to Clerkenwell." It seems that he was being spontaneous. If so, it was very brave, but it was also a brilliantly ambiguous phrase. Did he mean that he was taking the rebels' cause, or was he telling them that from now on they had to submit to the authorities? The peasants lowered their bows, breathed a sigh of relief, and followed their king to the fields of Clerkenwell. All through the revolt, they'd appealed to him for justice. Now their fate and that of the wounded Wat Tyler lay in his hands. Surely the divinely appointed monarch would see them right. Wat Tyler's outrageous demands for a new social order had led to a bloody confrontation at Smithfield. Now the peasants' revolt hung in the balance. Richard II led the remaining rebels off to the fields of Clerkenwell on the promise that he would be their new leader. Meanwhile, Tyler himself was bleeding to death here in the Abbey of St Bartholomew's. He'd been dragged here after he'd been stabbed. The monks were trying to keep him alive when the king's men burst in and dragged him outside for a show execution. They severed his head from his body, and with that blow, the revolution ended. They stuck the head on a spike and took it off to the fields of Clerkenwell, where the king had led the rebels. But at the same time, all the available loyal forces in every ward in London converged on Clerkenwell and surrounded them. When they saw Tyler's head and the show of force, the rebels threw away their weapons and dropped to their knees in the corn, begging forgiveness. The rebels had come within an inch of transforming the country. But with Wat Tyler's death, the momentum of the revolt was broken. And as the shockwaves of failure spread, the rebellion slowly died. Richard had never been on the peasants' side. He organised a ferocious backlash. The people of England were about to find out the price of revolution in the 14th century. The establishment wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. After the disaster at Smithfield, thousands of rebels went home, hopeful that they wouldn't be identified, but a small core clung on as outlaws. In the Middle Ages, if you were an outlaw, then like Robin Hood, you tended to hide in the forests, and 500 of them were cornered in the woods of Billericay and massacred. Then the king appointed commissioners to seek out and destroy the leaders of the rebels who'd returned home. They were to be punished, said the king, either according to the laws of the Kingdom of England, or else by other means and methods, by beheading, by mutilation of limbs, as seems to you both expeditious and sensible. The Billericay deaths were just part of a campaign of terror that shocked even the chroniclers of the time. Scholars estimate that hundreds died before official prosecutions began. And what about the individuals whose stories we've been following? Wat Tyler was probably already dead from his wounds when he was beheaded. John Ball suffered the full torture of being hung, drawn and quartered some months later. He died still proclaiming his simple faith. Many wealthier rebels like John Mocking the wine dealer, Thomas Raven the MP, and the men from Manningtree were pardoned and lived out lives of respectability. Unlike Thomas Wootton, the army deserter, he denied his part in the revolt and staked his life on a trial by combat. He lost. Then there was Richard Scott. He ended up in the pillory the next year, not for taking part in the revolt, but for cheating 2 Scotsmen at dice. And the man who started it all, Thomas the Baker, was hunted down. On the 4th of July, just a month after he sparked the revolt, he too was hung, drawn and quartered. Over the next 5 months, the last embers of the peasants' revolt were extinguished. But the authorities not only wanted the peasants defeated, they wanted the rebellion forgotten. Official spin started the process of masking the true nature and achievements of the summer of 1381. This is Sudbury in Suffolk, which seems to me to be the perfect place to end this journey because, despite the official pardons, the period after the revolt saw a vicious bloodbath of unofficial executions without trial. They weren't recorded, of course, so we've no idea how many. But in the 1930s, a whole cache of headless skeletons was found just over there, and local people believe they're the bodies of the last remnants of the rebels. They were reburied, of course, covered up, just like the true story of the Peasants' Revolt. This church was once the heart of an institution founded by Simon Sudbury, the hated archbishop who'd enforced the poll tax. His head had been hacked off by the rebels at the Tower of London. We know that the summer of 1381 was gloriously hot, but if you want proof of the fact, it's here. Sudbury's supporters rescued his head from the spike on which the rebels had stuck it and brought it back to this church. It's in this little cupboard here. There you go. Can you see that the air was so hot and dry that it actually mummified all the skin on the lower half of his skull? That is the head of the man who collected the very first poll tax. It was this that was paraded round on a spike on the 14th of June 1381, and there you can see the sword marks where his head was hacked from his neck. It's quite a bizarre historical relic, and it's just about the only tangible thing